we move on to a closely related operation called subtraction, right? And here we're finding the difference between two numbers. In other words, how far apart on the number line would these two numbers be? Very useful for all kinds of things. So this example will be the most straightforward because we don't have to do any borrowing / regrouping in order to make this happen. We line the numbers up the same way we did during addition to make sure that numbers of the same value are all grouped together so that we end up with a real answer and not something imaginary. And we can just go ahead and do the subtraction. So 3 minus 1, 2, 4 minus 2 is 2, and 5 minus 3 is 2. All right, now we'll try an example that requires either you call it borrowing or regrouping. And we try and do 3 minus 4, which is a possible operation, but we'll end up in the negatives. And I'm not sure that's what we want to do here, because if I think about 543 and 354, well, I will be able to subtract 354 and end up with a positive number. So I'm going to show you this method. We try and subtract 3 minus 4, and like I said, we get stuck. So if we go over to the column that has more value, which is the tens column right next to it, and we're going to regroup or borrow 10 of those over here. So then instead of 3, we now have 13. And what I can do is 13 minus 4, that will work, and I end up with the number 9. I move on and try and do 3 minus 5. Well, I've run into the same problem where that's going to give me a negative value. So is there something from a larger section where I can regroup or borrow from? And yes, there is. So from the hundreds, instead of 500, I'll bring that down to 400. And the 100 that I regrouped will come over here, and we've got now 13 minus 5, which is 8, and 4 minus 3, which is 1. All right, and we'll look at one more example where we need to borrow or regroup. This one gets a little trickier because, as you'll see in a second, we're going to try and borrow something from nothing, which is going to present a bit of a problem, but there's a fairly easy workaround, I think. So starting out, we try 7 minus 8, and that's going to give me a negative value, so we're trying to avoid that right now. So I'm going to try and borrow from the next column, but here we go. There's nothing to borrow from because that's a 0. So instead of doing that, I'm gonna move across a 0, another 1, all the way to 4 until I come across a number that I actually can borrow or regroup from. And what's going to happen here is if I look at that number as 400, in terms of the borrowing value of it anyway, if I look at that number as 400, and I was to borrow 1 from there, well, 1 less than 400 is 399, right? So I'm going to regroup the one that I borrowed over to make 17 instead of 7, and now I should be able to do my subtraction straight up. So 17 minus 8, well, 9 and 8 make 17, so that's what's left over. 9 minus 5 is 4. 9 minus 3 is 6, and 3 minus 1 is 2. And until we get into decimals and fractions, that's probably the trickiest that we're going to see in terms of subtraction. All right, so similar to adding, a couple of notes here. We did line up the decimal places so that each of our columns that we're subtracting contains the same value, and we also have a number on top here that has three numbers behind the decimal place, and one on the bottom that only has 2. So you can, same as we did with adding, you can either write a 0 in if it helps to organize things for you or makes it clearer, and that's great, you can do it, or you actually could leave it blank and go ahead from there. We are going to do the subtraction now, and I am able to do 1 minus 0, so that's good. 3 minus 9, I run into a bit of a problem, so I'm going to borrow 1 from the next column. 13 minus 9 is 4. Now we got 0 subtract 6. Well, that's not going to work either, so we're going to have to borrow over there. We now have 10 minus 6, which is 4. Next thing I should do is bring my decimal point down. Now subtract 6 minus 9. There's a lot of borrowing and carrying or regrouping, whatever you like to call it. 4 goes down to 3, and I carry over that 1. So 16 minus 9 is 7. 3 minus 2 is 1. And 5, well, there's nothing to subtract from the 5. This looks good. We started with 547 and change. Well, that's around 550. And if we subtracted 30 from 550, we'd end up around 520. And here I am at 517.441. So it looks like our work is correct. So we look at a slightly more complicated example, but we're going to follow the same concepts. We've got 90,000 subtract 5,361.43. Now 90,000 doesn't have a decimal listed, but the decimal always goes after the number. And if we want to do this subtraction, we're trying to subtract 4 from 4.43 from some unknown value here. There's nothing listed. So actually I think it is really helpful here to draw in the zeros to make sure that we're gonna get all the borrowing right. Okay, and so yeah, let's go ahead and figure out 0 minus 3 we're not going to be able to do, and so we're going to look to the next column, which we learned before was a 0, and we're not able to borrow from nothing, so we look at the entire number itself, which I guess is 900,000 if you ignore the decimal place in there. So what we're going to do is, yeah, we go to each one and we keep running into zeros until we finally get to a 9. So I'm going to borrow from that one. And 1 less than 900,000 is that, 899,999. The number that I'm borrowing or regrouping is going there. And now I should be able to do my subtraction without any other problems. So 10 minus 3 makes 7. 9 minus 4 makes 5. 9 minus 1 makes 8. 9 takes 6 is 3. 9 minus 3, 6. 9 minus 5, 4. And 8 has nothing to subtract from. And that's the result. And I think based on some quick estimation, 90,000 minus about 5,000, we get an answer close to about 85,000. Looks like we've done our work correctly, unless we've made an arithmetic mistake somewhere in there.